We're going to start everything back up here by first off bringing up Vipin Chamakkala from Workbench. Workbench is an investor in CoreOS and one of the more interesting kind of accelerators for enterprise technology within our space. Vipin's going to be having a kind of conversation here with Luigi Mercone from BNY Mellon, who's going to be kind of taking us through what some of the concerns are within the financial space and how Kubernetes is being used to solve some problems there. So if we can get a warm round of applause and bring folks up, that'd be fantastic. We've got Vipin and Luigi.
Hey everyone, I'm Vipin, a principal at Workbench. Workbench is an enterprise venture fund here in New York where, like CoreOS, we leverage a community of startups and corporates to identify amazing companies and areas to invest in. We love next-gen infrastructure and distributed systems. That's exemplified through some of our investments in companies like Cockroach Labs, Backtrace, and CoreOS. And CoreOS, amazing job here today. Putting together this summit, it's really remarkable to see some of the folks in the room. I'm thrilled to have Luigi Mercone here today, not just because he's an MD at a large financial services firm that relies on infrastructure to settle trillions of dollars a day, but because he gets technology and the business impact. And this lens enables him to be a true ally to startups. I've met with Luigi in multiple different contexts, and the passion that he has for the work that he does and the know-how is really remarkable. He has a very forward-thinking view on modern infrastructure, so I'm sure you'll all enjoy this conversation. So before we kick off, Luigi, can you share an off-balance sheet item about BNY Mellon that most people would not know just by knowing about the company?
Sure, and I've been with the bank for about 1.5 years. This certainly came as my moment of comeuppance to kind of walk in and discover that quietly and fairly behind the scenes that not only had we had a significant presence in terms of an internal corporate cloud for the better part of 5 years, that as measured in terms of OS instances, it was roughly half of the distributed estate. But the sort of kicker there was that we've been running a proprietary sort of nascent proprietary container for almost that length of time. So it's one of those things where like you get into an ecosystem, you try and take a step ahead, you wait for the ecosystem to catch up with you, and then it goes zooming right on past, and then you're chasing it.
So in this talk, we're going to go through BNY's journey to cloud native, and each step of the way we'll touch on Kubernetes and how it played into the decision process. So let's start off with, Luigi, the launch of your infrastructure strategy, and it would be great if you could share the what and why that drove the strategy.
Okay. Where we're at right now in our trajectory is, as I said, we're fairly far along and mature in terms of like having a well-established internal corporate cloud. And given my experience across the street, that can have a very, that's a skirt. That's not a fig leaf you can hide a lot of things behind. What does that really mean? Is it just IaaS? Is it a bunch of VMware and orchestration, or is it truly, a PaaS? With the type of services and automation that you'd expect there. So we're fairly far up that curve in terms of like having a well-established PaaS. From a cloud perspective, it's been the pivot in this, I'd say the past year or so, to like true cloud first in terms of like how we're thinking and engineering anything that's net new. And the other facet of that, and this is where it gets kind of interesting, at least to me, is because of the nature of who we are in the industry and how highly scrutinized and how regulated we are, we're pretty much the world's largest GSIFI, that pivot to, yes, we are going to consume public cloud is a bridge that we have not crossed yet, but from a mindset and an engineering perspective, everything that we're doing is focused on assume that that will be a go. So prepare in all the ways that you need to, do all the plumbing and bits that you need to get ready for that. That's not the interesting part. The interesting part, at least to me, is there's a mindset in terms of hygiene, packaging, security, treating capacity as essentially hostile, like making no assumptions on trust that you'd make going public, that we have very much internalized on how we're now choosing to consume our own internal capacity. So it's raised the bar of the narrative for how we think, not just going out, but actually reflecting back in.
So, I'm curious, when the pace of innovation, especially in this ecosystem, is so fast, how do you remain agile as a bank?
The fellow who was up earlier this morning and did the Ticketron pitch, Ticketmaster pitch, sorry, calling it by its original name. I was sitting in the back with a couple of guys from my team, and we're like, you can just substitute Bank of New York Mellon. I could have talked to the same deck. The element of there being a deep legacy of technology debt, and that the interest on that debt is really painful, I think is we feel it very, very keenly. So probably the biggest thing in terms of like how we've been embracing our cloud strategy is trying to make lots of smaller bets to iterate quickly, to gain operational experience as we go along. I mean, literally sort of embedding agile thinking, not just in our development, but like how we kind of build out our capabilities from an infrastructure perspective.
Interesting. During this process, I mean, you're making a lot of decisions. How do you mitigate the risk of potentially making a bad decision?
Well, the obvious things in terms of like looking and trying to make good choices as to what the logical levels of abstraction and segmentation are, being really disciplined about not getting seduced by the latest shiny object of a specific implementation, and where necessary, kind of building our own shimmer abstraction. So in the sense of like, do you want to go consume AWS or Azure natively, or is there, can we get something off the shelf to extract that from us, or does that create lock-in, or do you want to build our own abstraction layer for that? So here's the IaaS abstraction that lets you that lets you consume from any pool, which could be internal or external, and that's the kind of the API surface that we choose to make timeless and eternal.
Interesting. And be real with us, right? Like. A lot of folks here are at different parts of the adoption curve in cloud native. I'm curious, what has been the hardest part of this journey to, setting up this next generation infrastructure?
I think, and anyone who works in a large institution probably feels as keenly, it's getting out of our own way. I hate using terms like governance model because it immediately makes my eyes glaze over, but like, you can't, we don't have the freedom to just, insert credit card, turn knob, candy falls out, consume, great, there's your app. That trail of how do you, like, why do you consume, where do you consume, what's the governance model around, like, how it's been secured, it's fairly heavyweight for us. So, the tech wheel can iterate far faster than the cultural and governance wheel. So it's trying to overcome those impedance mismatches, do it once, do it right, and create a precedent that's then repeatable.
Interesting. And today, with your group, with your team, and at BNY, where do things stand today?
So the quick recap of the history in terms of like having had sort of a quote unquote internal cloud PaaS base that's actually meaningful, we've got a good history on that. I mean, a good number of years. It's gone through two sort of major iterations, from being basically an IaaS on steroids, something that's properly sort of model driven. It's in its third instantiation where we're pivoting it into from being purely a virtualization service into a full container service. The first sort of non-production access to that's happening like right now, this very month, and looking to have that live in the spring of next year in terms of being able to take on all commerce. A dimension of that, if you don't mind me just kind of unpacking a little bit, is the surface that we need to treat isn't great. Let's just go build, an idealized universe of 12-factor apps and all shall be good. we have to take on all comers in terms of being able to handle a much broader spectrum of workload classes. So it's had to be factored to be more of a common hosting platform with the kind of characteristics where you can land that web server, you could land that application server, but the team that's building database as a service can go and land that as a service on top of the platform as well. So the compute bit that we're kind of refreshing and elevating is now much broader in its technical capabilities, so that external service dependencies that were still being done in heritage or legacy manner can now be elevated on the platform, consume the platform, and become a service within the platform.
Interesting. And then during this entire time, Kubernetes has changed. How in your mind has it changed? And from a year ago.
I can be the next guy up here, sort of shrugs and says like, "Wow, a lot has happened in the past year. 40,000 commits." We had to make some choices a little over a year ago as to what's going to be the foundational layers of this sort of third generation of the platform. Great, we made our bets on Docker and Mesos. In terms of like the broad spectrum aspect of differentiated workloads that we have to handle, it seemed like a good and reasonable bet, and we're still happy with that. The maturation, the rate of change, the maturation, kind of like the velocity in terms of like the developer community has just gone super scalar, and that really helps. And I know I'm sort of jumping around, but like the broader context is, we see something like Kubernetes being working towards a multi-scheduler model, in essence, being able to drop that in there on top of Mesos at some point in time where it makes sense for like broadening out the spectrum of workloads.
Just to double click on this a little bit further, like when you mean multi-schedulers, kind of how do you envision this world playing out?
At the very least, and this is just kind of like 20 plus years in Wall Street, the fear and common sense, no SPOFs. Mm-hmm. An error and a spare. If you have a single platform level dependency, then great, you can have a single platform level vulnerability that completely blow you out of the water. So like, if only from that level of running in a well curated but heterogeneous environment, so that if you're doing A/B or from an infrastructure perspective, you literally are on different stacks.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Interesting. Very interesting stuff, and it's going to be interesting to see how that plays out. What are looking into 2017? So what are some of your key milestones and goals and initiatives for this year?
So, as I mentioned, getting the container service, fully elevated and production ready, living up to some of the commitments that we made to ourselves with how that's going to happen. We went fully down the rabbit hole in terms of like, no privileged access, no RDP, no shell, no SSH, immutable images. The cause of, like Beard to Homer Simpson, the cause of and solution to all of life's problems is redeploy. And this is a notion that from someone who comes from a traditional infrastructure background is probably heresy to a lot of my peers, but is becoming reality, which is the notion of a bidirectional service contract. So I elevate that VMware container for you. Here's all the goods and services you get, and as the infrastructure world, here's what I take back. So in terms of like the security and the access treatments, but that I reserve the right to shoot that container at any time in the next time period. Call it 60 days, 14 days, like whatever it is that you can negotiate with your user community. Because if I can get on that cadence of refresh, it accomplishes a lot of good things. It validates that your app is actually ready to operate in a cloud-native fashion. And there's a world of treatments that I otherwise don't have to handle in a point-by-point manner. Like, let's just say I'm redeploying every 1/60th on the environment on a rolling basis. It proofs the hell out of the environment, and there's huge surfaces in terms of like patching and upgrading that just don't have to happen because it's just going to get refreshed.
Interesting. And we've got a number of amazing startups here at the summit. What are in your eyes, pain points that still need to be resolved so that you can do your job better at BNY?
Well, Well, it's in the, like, a lot of the stuff is in the weeds, you know. I'm probably not telling anyone in this room something that they don't already know, but like when you first try and scale and load up, you know, Docker, there's a lot of things that surface in terms of like inherent immaturity or instability in the product. Logs filling up and overrunning. Like, it's not, you know, you got to paper train that stuff. So there's a fair amount of that we're shaking out on our journey.
Is there, from a cultural adoption perspective at BNY, what have you kind of done to sort of educate your employees on how to, you know, navigate this kind of new ecosystem?
Well, you know, the nature of our challenge is a little bit different, you know, in the sense that we made that pivot to cloud a good chunk of time ago. And you know, so you go in that model from the traditional, it's 4 to 6 months from ideation to purchase order to like someone elevates some tin and it has the right image on it and you can do something with it in the very old school traditional infrastructure manner, to one where it iterates in a couple of weeks. Is a couple of weeks ideal? Like, is a couple of weeks anywhere where the puck is already now? A couple of weeks has very rapidly become like the success, which is the stick with which you're beaten with, to get it closer to what you'd expect being able to get from a public cloud provider.
And then I'm jumping around too, but in terms of documentation and security, are there specific concerns to financial services that need to be addressed still?
You know, it took me some getting used to think in these terms too, because like I've been in the financial services industry mostly on the investment banking side, past year and a half, first time on the settlement and custody side. You know, if Ticketmaster, you know, has an outage and Beyonce tickets go on sale an hour late, there's a bunch of irate customers and there's potentially a revenue opportunity there. You know, we run systems that are so core to the functioning of the U.S. and global financial system that, like, you can end up with your CEO, you know, testifying before Congress kind of outages. So you have to, like, the mindset and the rigor with which you have to think about, like, what am I landing, where, how am I making those placement decisions, what's the rigor around it, you know, and you know, is this really a risk I feel like taking? You know, it's that sort gets far more complex.
And when you're talking to, you know, potential new vendors, engineers, are they coming in with this understanding, or is there kind of like, you know, a process where you need to level set with them, hey, this is what we're working with?
Yeah, by and large, and it's like there's a great Polish saying, you can't sit between two chairs. We're in the business of trying to sit between those two chairs, of having, you know, one cheek iterating very quickly and the other one, like, you know, thinking about it from a stability and quality perspective. Mm-hmm. And that second aspect is where it kind of gets a little orthogonal in those conversations.
It also touches on sort of like the greenfield, brownfield conversation. And I'm curious, like, you know, how have you guys navigated that, and what's the right approach?
You know, I don't think that there's any satisfying answer for that. I think that what we've ended up doing is you have to manifest some aspirational state. You have to concretize it. You have to productionize it. To quote my manager and boss, who's really inspirational, it's like, you know, up and running beats up and coming anytime. So, you know, pick a corner, get something up and running, use it as a living exemplar of what good looks like, and use that as like the pole star to drive towards. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
The other thing that I'm always hearing about is the lack of documentation within, especially the Kubernetes camp. Mm-hmm. Curious, you know, what can be done to address that for your work?
Let's issue everyone telepathy hats. You know, because we're as guilty of it. You know, that yes, it's immature and incomplete, and we, like, the thing that we've, at least for ourselves, is like you have to look in the mirror. So we built 2 generations worth of paths, and our documentation was horrible. I mean, inconsistent, incomplete, and that only an engineer could love. Whereas like you're like truly an engineer could love. So like we've held up that mirror to ourselves and have made a very disciplined effort of professionalizing and improving our own internal platform documentation to make it reasonable and consumable by the developer community.
So before we go into a brief session of Q&A, Luigi, any other kind of thoughts you want to share with the folks that we've got here in this room?
The future's here. That's pretty much it. Thank you.
Excellent. Now, if anyone has any questions, we're happy to take them at this time. Is it too early in the morning?
Yeah.
Yes.
There's a mic runner coming to you.
Luigi, you mentioned a 60-day lifespan for containers. Is that for the container runtime, or is that actually for the lifetime of that image? And what is your thought process on rebuilding an image, even if your major dependencies have not changed underneath?
So the 60 days is just an arbitrary number. It's just to say it's an arbitrary number that we're still kind of calibrating on, like what's a big enough span, what's a wide enough span so that we start fairly wide and start that thrash and learn what that means from a stability standpoint, but that it's a tight enough window that you don't, that if you get a cadence where the refresh is frequent enough that you're not incurring a whole lot of tech debt from a patching perspective. And it is a re-imaging. It's one of the non-obvious bits of thinking behind that is kind of a trust but verify, or belt and suspenders approach to the immutability of the image. So great, you're going to make it. You've got a CI/CD, you've got a pipeline, you've got all the mechanisms, all the automation, all the controls, to make sure that something that gets deployed, it hasn't changed. But even if there's no change in the inherent image and you've got a TTL on that thing, that's yet another compensating control that nothing has happened to change that image.
Any other questions?
Yeah. Over here, this side. Have you faced any pushback on the isolation capabilities of containers versus, say, VMs?
Oh, I don't think a day goes by where we don't kind of have the same my parents' 50-year marriage debate and argument over it, and like the security boundary around it is something that is like that it's just part of the we have to work with as part of the placement logic. Naturally, we're starting with things that don't. We're focusing up front on the things that don't hard challenge that boundary, kind of in a calibrated bet that we can land them in a VM if we need to in the meantime, and it gives us a little bit of time for that piece of the ecosystem to continue to mature.
Hi there. One more question, same spot. What's your posture towards the public clouds these days, and how do you see that evolving?
So back to my earlier point, posture being, and I have to be very methodical and precise on this so I don't get myself in trouble. We have not consumed yet in anything more than a prototypical or experimental manner. We haven't crossed that bridge yet. We are preparing ourselves as if that switch could get flipped at any moment. The tech stream is uncoupled from that and readying itself in anger. It's the governance model piece that needs to catch up, and the mindset of treating all capacity, whether it's in-house or external, is essentially is hostile or in a zero trust model. We're internalizing that mindset in how we think about consuming capacity wherever it's situated.
Hi, the same corner. Is your thinking changing around databases, both like analytic and transactional, as you move to or experiment with this new way of deploying applications?
Yeah, I think that's a given. Like any institution that's been around for, I think, 240 some odd years, we've got probably every data management solution ever conceived, including like, abacuses and papyri and, wet tablets and sharp styluses. So you've got that long trail of like, how do you take like conventional relational and get it to the point where like there's a database as a service like offering, like even not necessarily natively, to get the agility, but absolutely pivoting into some of the NoSQL, NewSQL, more cloud native approaches.
Any other questions? This one back there.
What are you using for monitoring and alerting, and was it difficult to incorporate that into your existing monitoring infrastructure?
So at this point, we're building up a bunch of capabilities around Prometheus, kind of as the core in the new platform. One of the things that is very attractive about looking at where Kubernetes is going is how much of that is actually kind of already baked in and matured. Having made the architectural biases, having established the architectural biases we had at the point in time that we did to kind of get out of the gate, I think that's kind of a reasonable approach. And as as the ecosystem continues to evolve, we're just going to bring in what makes sense.
We still have time for a few more in case folks want to ask Luigi a few questions.
All right.
Have you seen developers start implementing features that they never would have been able to without this? Like, are products changing with this functionality?
I'm sorry, I missed the beginning of the question, Frank.
Are you seeing developers implement new functionality that would have been difficult without this platform?
By platform, the paths that we have or the paths that we're in the business of elevating?
I guess elevating.
It's just started to go out in terms of like, the sort of friends and family users. I think it's more around the quality of speed, like of agility and speed. I'm making a very broad characterization. I apologize for that, but like our development community is used to sort of having to draw from the palette of existing colors. So the thing that we're trying to lean in more so, like emphasize up front, is just the velocity with which we can deliver and automate the delivery of the services that aren't already automated, and accelerate the velocity within which they can get that palette of services. Because like the real money on the table, the real opportunity there is pulling the lever of developer productivity. If you look at, and this is yet again hardly surprising, belaboring the obvious, if you look at sort of like the cost of sort of distributed versus the cost of the developer community, it's one of those trade-offs where it's like, I'd be ready to make a business case of like, your infrastructure is going to double in cost, but it's going to double your developer productivity. Like which lever would you rather pull to what benefit?
Are you seeing the latter where you need to buy a lot more hardware because developers now have any compute they need?
Well, the approach that we're taking for what we choose to do in-house is it's in terms of like raw numbers, is actually probably going to downtrend in terms of like headcount, but like far more significantly, we're using this as an opportunity for a very significant tech refresh and update, because literally our fleet management's kind of behind the curve and we want to get it up to date. And if you've got compute that's fully depreciated, and that's your refresh just from the classic Moore's law doubling, if all we did was stay in place, that's probably a 3 to 5 to 1 consolidation.
We have time for one last question.
In the back. BNY is a rather mature company, and I'm sure y'all have seen governance processes from several management schools of thought. How has the adoption of PaaS impacted the way your governance is managed?
It's that impedance mismatch. Sort of like the velocity of change. Take something as mundane as like traditional change control. How do you strap remedy to a container when that container might have a life cycle that's measured in seconds? So that's the real tension point, in terms of like, us being able to, us having to meet the challenge of a governance model that actually makes sense with infrastructure that's changing that's capable of changing that quickly.
Excellent.
Follow-up
Luigi?
question real quick.
Oh,
Sure.
Sorry. Can you describe how your actual organization of governance committees has changed to adopt this new approach?
Not especially. I mean, I got to be honest with you. I think that's the sonic boom that we're experiencing right now. We've got to form something that makes sense for the state that we're in. We've kind of gotten out a little bit further over our skis than we probably would want to in that regard. Of how do you have robust change control mechanisms in an organization that has to be kind of that responsible, and at the same time wants to be able to evolve in both development practices and the fleet of what's deployed in something that like remotely approximates what's achievable in modern world. I don't think I have an answer for you. I don't think we're there yet. That's a really big part of our struggle. Cheers.
Luigi, thank you so much
You're very
for
welcome.
sharing all of your wisdom and expertise. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, folks.